Hello, everyone. I'm Ernie Rubinstein, and I'm here with founder of the TCC congregation, Myrna Baron, and with the first rabbi and rabbi emeritus of the congregation, Peter Schweitzer. Um, I'm here to invite them to share some thoughts and reflections about the history of the congregation in celebration of our 30th anniversary party. They can't be with us in person, but they're zooming in to us from their home in Mount Kisco. Without Peter and Myrna, TCC would not be. Before we start our chat, though, I'd like to read some words from the book Contemplation, which was Rabbi Peter's project to gather in one place many of the addresses and talks that members of the congregation gave over the years, either at the high holidays or at Shabbats. There's several introductions to that book. One of them was written by Isabel Kaplan, former president of the congregation and longtime director of the Bar Mitzvah program. So Isabel, thinking back on her time with Myrna, wrote this: "I'm grateful that Myrna Baron took the audacious step 30 years ago to create one more Jewish congregation in New York City. I'm guessing that no one in that small group, which met in people's living rooms, would have imagined that 30 years later, we would be led by our second paid rabbi, have a steady membership, a capable board of directors, and have presided over 130 bar mitzvahs." Thinking back on Peter, on her work with Peter, here's what Isabel wrote: "In my longest and still ongoing stint at TCC running the Bar Mitzvah program, I worked closely with Rabbi Peter. The flow of ideas for writings, projects, new community service, and social actions was impressive. From his warm and humanistic perspective, Rabbi Peter has touched the lives of so many people. His talents and abilities contributed to our strength and cohesion over the years." So with that introduction, I think we're ready to start our chat. So I've got 5 questions for you, Peter and Myrna, and here's the first one. For the newer TCC members, can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing and your Jewish background? Was there anything about your early days, Myrna, that foretold you'd become the founder of a Jewish humanistic congregation? And Peter, was there anything about your background and childhood that foretold you'd become a Jewish humanistic rabbi? Peter?
Well, before I begin, I just want to thank you for providing us with this opportunity to share these thoughts with you and to celebrate with the congregation, this special event. And now I'll share some of my thoughts on your question. I grew up in Scarsdale in Westchester, and I attended the Westchester Reformed Temple. And my father was an early president, but I was not bar mitzvahed. But I do have 2 distinct memories from my childhood. One was singing the same songs over and over again, and particularly Hine Matov and Ein Kelohenu, which I think I maybe understood. And then the rabbi at the time also asked me to wave the lulav in the sukkah, and that hands-on experience has stuck with me for all these many years, and I tried to replicate that with kids at the kids' school. Otherwise, I had a typical Sunday school experience where I horsed around with my peers and we shot spitballs and defaced our books, and we give the teachers a hard time. I even dropped out for a while, but then I returned for my confirmation class. The very important point to make, however, is that during this entire time, I was still infused with a Jewish identity that was brought to me from my parents, my grandparents, and that was passed down in the generations. When I went to college, I had several defining moments and experiences. I went to Israel during my freshman summer, and I worked as in an archaeological dig. I came back to the States and I decided I wanted to learn Hebrew finally for the first time. So I attended intensive Ulpan at all places, the University of Santa Cruz in California, which is a beautiful place to spend your summer. The Yom Kippur War happened in 1973 when I was a junior, and I was already involved with Hillel. We were more optimistic in those days about Israel's future than we are today, unfortunately. And we've seen, obviously, a rightward swing that's very disheartening. These experiences motivated me to want to continue my Jewish studies. But rather than go for a PhD, I was attracted to the rabbinate. But as I was used to saying, like many of my classmates, we had very little prior upper level Jewish experience or education, and we were blank slates. To that extent, we had if we had open minds, like I did, we made it possible to migrate finally to humanistic Judaism. I had heard about humanistic Judaism and in rabbinical school, but it didn't appeal to me at first. I tried on for size becoming a Reform rabbi, but it was over time, it became disenchanted with the Reform liturgy, particularly the patriarchal language, and especially the message at funerals, not to complain or not, but to trust in God. Eventually, I left the Reform Temple, and where I was working in Indianapolis, I came back to New York. I did a brief stint in publishing. I went and got my social work degree. I rediscovered humanistic Judaism and felt that it would be a better fit for me. Most importantly, I met Myrna and then Sherwin Wine, and the rest is history.
Thank you, Peter. Myrna?
So I grew up in a conservative synagogue with a nearly Orthodox rabbi and likely a Reform congregation. So there was very little consistency with the rituals in the synagogue and with our home events and our family's values and beliefs. My mother had grown up in an Orthodox home, and the language that was used at the time when I was growing up was completely patriarchal, like Peter mentioned, our father, our king. So I was given a choice of whether or not to have a bat mitzvah. Both of my brothers were bar mitzvahed, but my parents gave me the option of a bat mitzvah or a sweet 16. And of course I chose the sweet 16 because my brothers hated their education. Later, when I was a young adult, I started studying with a Reform rabbi because I wanted to know more. And that raised more questions than it provided answers. And it didn't last very long, but I was obviously interested in the history and in the why of our mythology rather than the teachings from it. And I had never been, by that point, I had never been a joiner or a leader and couldn't have imagined myself in what was later to come with the city congregation. In 1989, I was pregnant with Blair and thinking about how do I want to infuse Jewish culture in our home. And I didn't know that there was a way to do it in a congregational context until I read an article by Rabbi Wein. So finally, without the aid of the internet, I tracked down the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and they sent me a booklet called Becoming Parents. And I was struck by the language of a non-gendered or a non-gender biased welcoming event for a baby. And they said that the public welcoming ceremony ought to be the same for a boy or a girl, which means if you're circumcised, that's in the hospital, because once you do that in public, it changes your event based on the gender of your baby. And so it really spoke to me personally. And at the time, there was no community in New York City. The Westchester community was primarily retirees and older adults. So I started reading materials from SHJ and tried to infuse it into our home. And then 2 years later, we started, but we'll come back to that.
Well, thank you both for sharing so much from your lives. You know, Myrna, you began to anticipate the second question I have for you, which is just when you think back on the early days of TCC, what were some of the biggest challenges and what were some of the greatest successes?
Right. So the biggest challenges always in a volunteer organization are having enough volunteers to do the work. At the time when we started, there were 6 adults in my living room and 2 toddlers doing somersaults in the middle of us. So one of the biggest challenges was having enough people to have the energy to do all the work of launching a congregation. I happened to have a small PR marketing firm at the time. And so I had access to a copy machine and a postage meter. And long before email and the internet, everything had to be done by postal mail. So whatever we developed, I photocopied, I stuffed in envelopes, I ran the postage, I printed it, and I covered the costs of that for the first years, just sort of built it into the business. And I was doing the administrative tasks, and other people were starting to work on programming. And this was before Peter joined us. So we were cutting and pasting from Rabbi Wein's book Celebrations and Shirley Rands, who was one of the first members, had recommended having Shabbat in people's homes. And so a small group of us would bring food, have a potluck Shabbat around the dining table, and word started to spread a little bit. The two early successes that came out of that were about 2 years in. Rabbi Wein came and did a conference for us at the Gramercy Park Hotel, and we had well over 100 people there. And we advertised in the New York Times and ran a sponsorship spot on WNYC, and got lots of phone calls, hundreds and hundreds of phone calls in response to this message of a cultural secular Jewish community. And we started to take off from there. And the other, I think, was the very early days of the kids, before Kids School actually existed. We knew that if young parents wanted to participate, we had to provide childcare for their kids. So Blair was 2.5. Billy Pivnik, Sherwin's niece, who lived in Brooklyn, was with us in those days, and she had a 2-year-old son. And so other people started coming in who had very little children, because we had NYU babysitters, essentially, providing childcare and doing songs and poems, rhymes about the holidays with the little kids. And if they were taken care of, then the adults could participate. And that sort of grew into the Kids School later.
So
that's quite a success. Please, Peter.
Sure. So from my perspective, and I think Myrna will share this, it was very important for us at the outset to get the words right and the message that we wanted to articulate. And Sherwin Wein had expressed this thought very succinctly, that in a quote that we repeat over and over again, to say what you believe and believe what you say, and to be consistent with your philosophy. So we went over the texts very, very carefully to make sure that they fit our values. And this was actually a wonderful experience, because it was participatory. It wasn't top down from the unofficial rabbi, which was me at the time. And it also showed that we could constantly be revising our texts. And when the computer evolved, it made it even more easier. There were 2 other challenges, I think, that we had to deal with. The first was that from the very beginning, we were wandering Jews. We had to keep finding new spaces to meet for high holidays and for Shabbat, and that would fit our budget, right? And we had to figure out how to store things. If they could store our supplies, would the space provide us a room or a closet? We were at the whim of these various institutions when we rented space. They set the dates for their schedule. We had to work around them, and we had to find places that could accommodate us. One of our early features that Myrna had mentioned, in a sense, with the follow-up to our Shabbat dinners at home, was that we had really a lot of joy having meals together. And we used to do that regularly on Shabbat. We lost something when we couldn't find a space that we were able to eat together. We also had high holiday meals together. But we found that to be quite difficult at times and more costly and harder to arrange. So that evolved into going to restaurants, but that still wasn't the same thing as having the community in one big room, sticking around after holidays to eat together. Another example I just want to add into this mix of the challenges was the constant ebb and flow of membership. We would gain members, we would lose members, and we were constantly having to integrate new members, which meant repeating our message and our mantra over and over again to new people. And sometimes it bored the old people to hear over and over again why had we to come here. But it makes for vitality, and it also puts a strain on the community.
Well, some of the challenges you both mentioned are still with the congregation. So thank
and will
you
be
for
forever.
giving us some perspective there.
Yeah.
You know, Myrna, you mentioned in passing Sherwin Wein. Would you like to say anything a little bit about your memories of him and how he helped you get the congregation going?
Absolutely. So when Blair was 3 months old, and I had been reading materials from SHJ, I noticed that he was going to speak at a conference in Connecticut. So I left Blair with a sitter, schlepped up to Connecticut to hear Sherwin. And to my surprise, there were hundreds of people in this meeting room. And, you know, we had this nothing, we didn't have a community yet. And I didn't know that this was widespread in the area. So minutes into his presentation, I was just struck that he was articulating how I felt about Jewish identity. And afterwards, I went up to him and I said, "Hi, I'm in public relations. Why don't more people know about this?" And I didn't know what I was getting myself into. He called me afterwards when he went back to Detroit and to arrange a meeting with me for the next time he came to New York. And at that meeting, he started recruiting me to start a community because he saw this young at the time, enthusiastic, energetic person, and he thought he'd take advantage of it. He also gave me the number of his niece who lived in Brooklyn, and I reached out to her, and she and I started on some of the initial work. It took 2 years to have the first meeting, but during that time, Rabbi Wein was advising us from the background and encouraging us and meeting with us to nudge us along every time he came into New York. Over time, he became my friend and mentor, and somebody who I called to share joys and difficulties in my life. The last time I saw him was a few months before he died, and it was 6 months into my medical condition. And I was in extreme pain. I could hardly walk, and I wasn't using the scooter yet. And we were at a conference in Boston together, and we found time to sit alone and talk. And he gave me a phrase that has stuck with me for all these years. And he's talked about finding strategies for coping, which is purely humanistic, right? You have adversity, how do you cope with it? And that stayed with me. That was in 2007. So all these years, I think about that whenever either I have difficulty or someone in my family does, and we talk about strategies for coping. And it's a wonderful legacy that he left, not just for the community, but also for me personally. I still continue to learn from him now that there's a website with all of his writings and video and audio of his life's work. And I'm reading through it now. And it's such a joy to go back and study again with him, even though we can't be with him personally.
Yeah. Yeah.
So early on, I was attracted to Sherwin's message, but in the beginning, I felt like an interloper. Others had been working in the trenches of humanistic Judaism for many years, and I was a newcomer. But I quickly became knowledgeable and eventually gained respect in the movement. And Sherwin was a great support and help. And he had hopes for me, as he did for Myrna, but he had hopes for me early on to recruit me back into the rabbinate. But I resisted him at first. I wasn't ready. Over time, he wore me down, and I became more comfortable with the idea, and I returned, obviously. I think there are lots of moments, small and big, in meetings or small little conversations on tours or just casually getting together, where we saw Sherwin's humor, his intellect, and it all came forth. And it was very inspiring to us. And on another level, Myrna and I were particularly honored that he officiated at our wedding.
Well, just a footnote to one of your comments, Myrna, about coping. That concept found its way into the contemplation book as one of the headings. So it had a profound impact on, I think, on the congregation as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me ask now about the past 30 plus years of the congregation that you've both been involved with it, and just ask if you can share some of your proudest moments with the congregation. Myrna?
So for me, it was definitely the kids' school and the B Mitzvah program. The kids' school started with like a one-room schoolhouse where 2 parents were teaching very young preschool children. And as more people joined in, we hired a professional teacher to teach another age group. And then as more people came, we kept expanding. And for the what we then called the Bar Bat Mitzvah program, and is now the B Mitzvah program, we had these young kids in a couple of different classes. And I received this wonderful phone call from Mickey Mandel. And she said, we're music teachers. What can we do to help? And she had been doing her own personal version of what was humanistic Judaism in her home with Abe and with her children for decades. And so together, so they had a child, their daughter Lonnie was older than the other kids, and we needed to develop a bar mitzvah program for her. So Peter and I worked on sort of the structure of it. I sat with Lonnie around my dining room table and taught her the other things I thought she ought to know about Jewish history. And Mickey and Abe developed the music. And so together, that was the origin of the bar mitzvah program. And now we've had so many kids go through it. And I mentored a lot of kids in the early years, and many of them are still in touch with me and with us. And that's a, you know, that's a real joy to know that they feel that connection. Also, personally for us, both our kids, Oren and Blair, have integrated humanistic Judaism into their lives and their work. And continuity is also part of this, of course.
So I think back on accomplishments and what we're proud about. And one of the things that comes to my mind, first and foremost, are high holidays that were presented that really connected to people and that really evoked very meaningful sharing, personal connections that you don't normally see in a congregation, and that I could pull off leading a conversation with 150, 200 people in the room that was respectful most of the time. And that we really were able to gain a lot from those experiences. The adult perspectives that we had on Sunday also engaged us in participants in sharing some very difficult topics at times. They weren't just, educational, but they were confronting how we felt about things, and we weren't always in agreement. And that was okay, because it was really all for the good. I also obviously remember fondly the bar and bat mitzvahs that we had and that I officiated at for many, many years, including Blair's and Oren's. But one of them that stands out, I shouldn't really, call out anybody over anybody else, but one of them stands out because we think it was the first of any kind, was our special joint ceremony for Miriam Chisti, which was a Jewish Muslim event, and which the imam participated with me as officiants. And then her sister Chava had one similarly a few years later. And again, we made that possible in the congregation. And again, it's one of these things that we will never forget. And lastly, we certainly had, our happy times, and we also had plenty of sad times. And it was always meaningful to bring comfort to a family and a community in their times of need.
Well, you've both given a mouthful for us to think about. I'll just add that I'm indebted to you both for the bar mitzvah program because of the opportunity I had to mentor in it. But I also just mentioned, Peter, in terms of the discussions at the high holidays, it was partly because of the discussion on the meaning of life in 2016 that I joined the congregation. It was a very balanced and meaningful discussion that time.
Yeah.
Well, we're nearing the end. Let me give you one more question. And this one is just what advice you have for TCC as it looks to its future. Myrna?
So it's hard to give advice from the outside. Through COVID, we've only connected through Zoom. But I would say promote inclusivity. From the beginning, we recognized that families had diverse backgrounds, or at the beginning, we talked about intercultural backgrounds. And we wanted in the bar mitzvah program for the students to include all of their family backgrounds in their research and their event. I hope that idea has been broadened to also include interracial families and same-sex families, and importantly, even just the intellectual perspectives that differ within a family. And sometimes it's not just about knowing the origins of Judaism, but humanistic Judaism teaches that our contemporary literature and modern scholarship, modern archaeological scholarship, affect who we are and our understanding of history. And all of that, I think, ought to be always included in communications, internal and external, and in programming. so that we're not just focused on one time period over another or one group of our community over another.
Thanks, Myrna.
So I have a few points I'd like to bring out, which I think are my advice to the congregation and membership. First of all, we have a message which appeals to many people. Be creative about reaching out. Don't apologize. Be proud of our message and learn to articulate it comfortably. Always be welcoming. That's what Myrna said about being inclusive. It's natural for our older members to stick around to each other and to talk to each other when we gather, before and after an event, but it's essential to reach out to new members and to visitors and guests and to integrate them into the community. Be open to new ideas, seek them out. Otherwise, the congregation will be stagnant. Cultivate volunteers, teachers, and altruism, and don't be bashful about asking for money. Finally, I think many of you are aware that I've been getting treatment for pancreatic cancer for the past 2.5 years. There have been plenty of ups and downs, as you can see, but I'm still here. And I am happy to have this moment to celebrate with the congregation and with all of you that has meant so much to me. I've had wonderful support from my family, and but also equally important is the support and love and friends that I have from people here in this community. And that's what it's all about, the community. So thank you all very much for helping me and Myrna and supporting the congregation, and best wishes for the future.
Peter and Myrna, thank you both for giving us your thoughts and attention, for all of your work leading the congregation over the years, and for the inspiration that you've given to all of us. You're picture perfect from my angle here in New York City. You both look wonderful, and the trees in the background are a beautiful setting for you. It just remains for me at this point to join with you in congratulating the congregation on 30 years plus of active life, and to wish for 30 or more. So I think we'll sign off now, and
Ernie.
Thank you.
okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.